My husband told me I should stick to designing pretty spaces at our anniversary dinner in front of his entire executive team. 6 months later, his face turned ashen when he discovered his company had lost their biggest historical renovation contract overnight. Now he manages maintenance requests at one of my properties, the same property I secretly purchased through my restoration company 3 years ago. Stick to designing pretty spaces, indeed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The string quartet played softly in the background as waiters in crisp black uniforms glided between tables at Riverview Terrace. Portland's downtown skyline sparkled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, mirrored in the Willamette River below. I smoothed the napkin across my lap, perfecting the pleasant smile I'd worn for nearly 10 years of marriage as Tom raised his champagne glass. "To the woman who keeps my home beautiful while I build Portland's skyline," he announced to the table. Of 12, his executive team and their spouses gathered for what was supposed to be our anniversary celebration. Somehow it had morphed into a Westview Development business dinner with a side of anniversary acknowledgement. Kevin Anderson, Tom's business partner, raised his glass in response. "To Becca, who's always been so supportive of Tom's vision." I maintained my smile, feeling it strain at the edges as Tom continued. "She wanted to study architecture in college, but she found her true calling making our house look pretty instead." Gentle laughter rippled around the table. Much better fit for her talents. What Tom didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my decorating hobby had evolved into Cascade Restoration, a historic building renovation company I'd quietly established 3 years ago. The design magazines I read were actually industry, journals and architectural reviews. My girls' weekends often involved meeting with investors and contractors. The community meetings I attended were networking events with Portland's most influential property developers and preservationists. And the Willamette Warehouse District project that Westview Development was currently bidding on? I'd secured it yesterday, after months of careful preparation. "Isn't that right, sweetheart?" Tom's voice pulled me back to the present. "I'm sorry?" I asked, my smile never faltering. "I was just telling everyone how you nearly had a panic attack trying to understand the financing proposal for the Sullivan Building project." Tom chuckled, his hand squeezing my shoulder with what others might interpret as affection. "Some people just aren't wired for business complexities." Across the table, I caught Vanessa Cooper's eye, Tom's executive assistant, and the woman who'd been sending him text messages at midnight for the past 4 months. The woman whose perfume occasionally clung to Tom's suits. She offered a sympathetic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Actually," I began, my voice soft but clear, "I found the proposal quite straightforward. I just questioned the environmental impact assessment." Tom laughed a little too loudly, reaching for his third glass of champagne. "See what I mean? Always concerned with how things look, rather than the business fundamentals." The Sullivan Building proposal had indeed been straightforward in its cutting of corners and environmental oversights. I had reviewed it thoroughly the night Tom had left it on his desk while stepping out for a late meeting with Vanessa. Its flaws were precisely why I'd designed a superior proposal through Cascade Restoration, emphasizing sustainable renovation practices while maintaining historical integrity. "Rebecca has such a good eye for beauty," Vanessa offered, her voice honey-sweet. "The Christmas party decorations at your home last year were magazine-worthy." "That's exactly what I mean," Tom nodded enthusiastically. "My wife knows her strengths. No shame in sticking to what you're good at." I took a deliberate sip of water, observing the dynamics around the table. The nervous glances between Kevin and his wife. The way Vanessa leaned slightly toward Tom when she spoke. The uncomfortable shifting of other executives who seemed to sense the undercurrents but chose to ignore them. For nearly 10 years, I'd played the role Tom had assigned me, the supportive wife who managed the home front while he built his empire. the former architecture student who had supposedly found fulfillment in selecting paint colors and arranging furniture. It wasn't entirely an act. I did love design. But Tom had never understood that my passion extended far beyond aesthetics, to structural integrity, historical preservation, and sustainable renovation, all areas where Westview development frequently fell short. When I'd tried explaining this early in our marriage, Tom had patted my hand and said, "That's why I handle the real development work, sweetheart. You focus on making spaces pretty." After years of similar dismissals, I'd stopped trying to engage him in professional conversations. Instead, I began building something of my own, quietly, methodically, and without his knowledge. "Tell them about your latest project," Tom prompted, his words slightly slurred. "The guest bathroom renovation that took 3 contractors to get right." The project he referred to had actually been a test, a deliberate experiment to see if Tom ever truly paid attention to my work. I had invented problems with contractors who didn't exist, describing issues that never occurred, all while actually using the time to meet with potential investors for Cascade restoration. Tom had nodded absently through my fabricated updates, never once asking to see the supposedly troubled bathroom or noticing that no construction had actually taken place. "It's coming along," I said simply. "Women and their bathrooms," Kevin laughed, raising his glass again. "My wife's the same way. Never satisfied until everything's perfect. A perfectionist in all the ways that matter," Tom agreed, his hand finding my knee under the table in a gesture that once would have seemed affectionate, but now felt performative. "Which reminds me, the Watson property is finally ready for staging. Becca, you should call that interior designer you like. What's her name? The one who did the Henderson's place." The Watson property was a historically significant building that Westview had stripped of its original features and converted into luxury condos, exactly the kind of project that had inspired me to start Cascade Restoration as an alternative approach to development. And the designer he mentioned was actually my front person, Eleanor Jenkins, a retired architect who had become my mentor and occasional public face when I needed to maintain anonymity. "Eleanor," I supplied. "I'll give her a call." Tom turned, his attention back to the table, launching into a detailed explanation of Westview's innovative approach to urban development, an approach that primarily involved maximizing profit margins while paying lip service to historical preservation. As he spoke, I noticed Vanessa watching him with naked admiration, occasionally jotting notes in a small notebook as though his standard talking points were revelatory insights. My phone vibrated discreetly in my clutch. I excused myself to the restroom, where I checked the message from Daniel Martinez, my lawyer. "Final documents signed. Sullivan Building contract officially awarded to Cascade. Announcement embargoed until 9 a.m. tomorrow." I stared at my reflection in the ornate bathroom mirror. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, Tom would discover that the Sullivan Building project he'd been confidently pursuing for months had been awarded to a competitor he didn't even know existed. A competitor run by his wife, whom he'd been encouraging to stick to designing pretty spaces for years. Tomorrow, he would also likely move forward with what I suspected were his plans to leave me for Vanessa. Plans I'd discovered while reviewing our shared accounts and finding a recently leased apartment in her name, paid for with Tom's secondary credit card. But tonight, I would play my part, one last time. Tonight, I would be the supportive wife he had always taken for granted, even as I prepared for a tomorrow he couldn't begin to anticipate. I returned to the table just as dessert was being served, an elaborate anniversary cake Tom had ordered to demonstrate what a thoughtful husband he was. The irony wasn't lost on me as he stood to make another toast. "To 10 years with this beautiful woman," he announced, his charm on full display as he raised his glass, "who proves every day that behind every successful man is a woman who knows exactly what her role should be." I raised my glass along with everyone else, my smile firmly in place. If Tom had been more observant, he might have noticed it didn't. Reached my eyes. If he'd been more attentive, he might have seen the knowing glance exchanged between me and Eleanor, who had joined the dinner late as a surprise guest. If he'd been sober enough, he might have questioned why I seemed so calm, despite the tensions simmering beneath the surface. But Tom noticed none of these things. He was too busy being the center of attention, too confident in his assessment of me, too secure in his belief that I would always be exactly what he needed me to be: decorative, supportive, and unambitious. My wife doesn't concern herself with the cutthroat world of real estate development, he continued, his hand heavy on my shoulder. She's found her happiness in creating beautiful spaces for us to enjoy at the end of the day. Isn't that right, Becca? Everyone finds fulfillment, in different ways. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I replied diplomatically. Exactly. Tom nodded, missing the subtlety in my response. And tomorrow we'll be one step closer to adding the Sullivan Building to Westview's portfolio. Kevin and I have a meeting with the review board at 10 a.m. Isn't that right, Kevin? Kevin shifted uncomfortably. That's the schedule, he confirmed, though his expression suggested he wasn't sharing Tom's confidence. It's practically a done deal, Tom proclaimed, winking at Vanessa, who smiled back with unmistakable intimacy. I excused myself once more. As the evening wound down, stepping onto the restaurant's terrace for a moment of fresh air. Portland's skyline glittered before me, the city I loved and had secretly been reshaping through my work at Cascade Restoration. Every building had a story, a history worth preserving while thoughtfully adapting to modern needs. This philosophy had become the cornerstone of my company, a philosophy Tom had repeatedly dismissed as impractical and unprofitable. My phone vibrated again with a text from Megan, my best friend, and the only person who had known about Cascade from the beginning. Everything set for tomorrow? Need backup? All set, I replied, meeting with Daniel at 8 a.m. to review final transition plans. Tomorrow wouldn't just reveal Cascade Restoration's successful bid on the Sullivan Building. It would also set in motion the financial separation I had methodically prepared for over the past 2 years, the careful transfer of my inheritance and earnings into separate accounts, the documentation of Tom's increasingly questionable business practices, and the evidence of his relationship with Vanessa. I hadn't planned for this anniversary dinner to be our last public appearance as a couple, but Tom's behavior tonight, and the finalization of the Sullivan contract, had accelerated my timeline. There would be no better moment to reveal the truth than when Tom was forced to confront both his professional failure and my professional success simultaneously. Eleanor joined me on the terrace, her silver hair catching the light from the city below. He has no idea, does he? She asked, quietly. None, I confirmed. Men like Tom never do, she said, her voice reflecting decades of similar experiences in the architecture world. They're so convinced of their own narrative that they never question it, even when the evidence is right in front of them. Eleanor had become more than a mentor over the past 3 years. She had become the professional ally Tom should have been, encouraging my vision, challenging my ideas, and helping me build something meaningful. She had never once suggested I stick to making things pretty. Are you ready for tomorrow? She asked. I looked back through the windows at Tom, now deep in conversation with Vanessa, their heads tilted toward each other with unmistakable familiarity. Kevin was watching them with obvious discomfort while the other dinner guests were beginning to gather their things. I've been ready for 3 years, I answered. Tomorrow just makes it official. As we returned inside to say our goodbyes, Tom draped his arm around my shoulders, playing the role of devoted husband for their audience. Another successful evening, he declared. Everyone was impressed with the venue choice. I'm glad, I replied, knowing he was referring to the restaurant I had carefully selected months ago, not for our anniversary, but for this specific moment in time. Riverview Terrace was owned by one of Cascade Restoration's key investors, a fact Tom had never bothered to learn. In the car ride home, Tom was already focused on tomorrow's meeting, rehearsing his pitch for the Sullivan Building as if I were merely an audience for his performance rather than a partner in his life. I made appropriate noises of acknowledgement as he spoke, all while mentally reviewing my own preparations for the following day. Vanessa really pulled together some impressive materials for tomorrow's presentation, Tom commented, his voice carefully casual. She's been invaluable lately. I'm sure she has, I replied evenly. She might join us for dinner again sometime next week, he continued. She's been asking about the house renovation process, thinking of buying a fixer-upper herself. The transparent excuse hung in the air between us. 3 months ago, I might have pretended to believe it. Tonight, with everything already in motion, I simply nodded. Speaking of renovations, Tom said, changing the subject, how's that bathroom coming along? Do we need to throw more money at it? The bathroom that didn't exist, the renovation that had never happened, the contractors who were figments of my imagination. It's nearly finished, I said, just waiting on the final fixtures. Good, he mumbled, already checking his phone for messages, no doubt from Vanessa. When we arrived home, Tom immediately retreated to his office, claiming he needed to review materials for tomorrow's meeting. I didn't bother telling him I knew exactly what those materials entailed. I had reviewed the same proposal weeks ago when evaluating my competition for the Sullivan Building contract. Instead, I went to our bedroom and carefully selected what I would wear tomorrow, a tailored charcoal suit I had never worn in Tom's presence, paired with architectural statement jewelry that had been a gift from Eleanor when Cascade secured its first major contract. Tomorrow would be the day I finally stepped fully into my professional identity, no longer hidden behind the facade of being merely Tom's wife who makes spaces pretty. As I heard Tom's hushed voice on the phone in his office, no doubt updating Vanessa on their timeline, I felt a strange sense of calm. The anger and hurt I had carried during the early days of discovering his betrayal had evolved into something more powerful. The quiet certainty that I had built something valuable while he had been busy underestimating me. Tomorrow, Tom would walk into the Sullivan Building meeting expecting to secure a contract that had already been awarded to someone else. Tomorrow, he would return home to find divorce papers and evidence of his affair carefully organized on the kitchen counter. Tomorrow, he would discover that many of his business's assets, including the Watson property he had mentioned at dinner, had been quietly acquired by Cascade Restoration through a network of subsidiaries I had established. Tomorrow, the wife he had encouraged to stick to designing pretty spaces would reveal herself as the business competitor who had outmaneuvered him at every turn. I laid out my clothes for the morning and checked my alarm. In 12 hours, everything would change. But tonight, I would sleep soundly, knowing I had already secured my future, while Tom remained blissfully unaware that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse around him. After all, some people just aren't wired to see beyond their own assumptions, especially when those assumptions involve underestimating a woman they've dismissed for far too long. The seed had been planted 3 years ago, during a dinner similar to tonight's. Tom had been explaining to a potential investor why Westview's approach to renovating the historic Palmer Building would bring it into the modern era. "We'll gut the interior, of course," he had said confidently. "Keep the facade for the historical preservation people, but inside will be all contemporary. Those old buildings are just shells anyway, nothing worth saving." I had nearly choked on my wine. The Palmer Building featured hand-carved woodwork by a renowned 19th-century craftsman, original tile mosaics in the lobby, and a central staircase that architectural students still studied. Gutting it would destroy irreplaceable artistry and craftsmanship. When I gently mentioned these features later that night, Tom had laughed. That old-fashioned stuff doesn't sell luxury condos, Becca. People want open floor plans and modern amenities, not creaky wood and outdated layouts. That night, as Tom slept beside me, I had opened my laptop and registered the domain for Cascade Restoration. By morning, I had drafted a business plan. Within a month, I had secured my first small investor, an old college classmate who remembered my architectural designs and had always wondered why I'd given up on my career. I hadn't given up. I had simply gone underground. More wine, Becca? Kevin's wife, Lisa, offered, pulling me back to the present. No, thank you, I replied with a warm smile. I want to stay clear-headed for tomorrow. Big plans? She asked conversationally. Tom answered before I could respond. She's meeting with that interior designer I mentioned, Eleanor something, for the Watson property. Jenkins, I supplied. Eleanor Jenkins. Right. Tom nodded absently, already turning back to Vanessa to discuss tomorrow's presentation. Little did he know that my meeting with Eleanor was actually to finalize our strategy for the Sullivan Building announcement. Eleanor had become more than my mentor. She was my public face when needed, allowing Cascade Restoration to operate with a degree of anonymity that had proven invaluable. Her decades of experience in architecture and historic preservation gave our young company immediate credibility, while her network of contacts had opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. Eleanor Jenkins? Lisa's eyebrows raised slightly. Isn't she that famous architect who retired a few years ago? I didn't realize she was doing interior design now. She's diversifying her interests, I said smoothly. Tom laughed, catching the end of our exchange. Trust Becca to somehow land a celebrity designer for a simple staging job. She has a way of connecting with these creative types. The irony of his statement wasn't lost on me. Eleanor had indeed been a connection I'd made at an architectural preservation conference I'd attended while Tom thought I was at a spa weekend with friends. She had seen my portfolio of designs, recognized the passion and technical skill behind them, and offered to mentor me. When I explained my situation, she had understood immediately. You wouldn't be the first architect whose talents were dismissed by those closest to her, she had told me. The question is, what are you going to do about it? What I had done was build Cascade Restoration from the ground up, with Eleanor's guidance and occasionally her public endorsement when a project required a recognized name. We had started small, renovating neglected historic homes in Portland's older neighborhoods. Each project had been carefully selected to fly under Tom's radar, properties too small for Westview development to consider, in neighborhoods they rarely focused on. As my confidence grew, so did our projects. Last year, we had successfully renovated the Harmon Building, a historic firehouse that had been converted into a community arts center. The project had won a local preservation award, an award I had sent my regrets for, allowing Eleanor to accept it in my stead while I attended one of Tom's business dinners. The painful irony was that Tom had actually commented on the Harmon Building renovation over breakfast one morning. Newspaper opened to an article featuring photos of the completed project. Now this is how restoration should be done, he had said, admiringly. Keeping the character while making it functional. Westview should look into whoever did this. I had nearly told him then. The words had risen to my lips, ready to reveal that the work he admired was mine. But something had held me back. Perhaps it was the knowledge that he would somehow make my achievement about him. Perhaps it was the growing suspicion that things with Vanessa had progressed beyond professional boundaries. Or perhaps it was simply that I wasn't ready to merge my two worlds, not until I had built something so undeniably successful that Tom couldn't possibly diminish it. The Sullivan Building is going to be Westview's crown jewel, Tom was now telling the table, his voice carrying that confident edge that had once charmed me. We've got plans that will transform that old warehouse into the most sought-after address in Portland. While preserving its historical significance, of course, Kevin added quickly, perhaps sensing my attention return to the conversation. Tom waved a dismissive hand. Sure, sure. We'll keep the brick exterior and those big windows everyone loves. But inside, everything modern. Nobody wants to live with 100-year-old infrastructure. I took another sip of water, hiding my expression. Cascade's proposal for the Sullivan Building had focused extensively on preserving and showcasing that 100-year-old infrastructure. The exposed timber beams, the original freight elevator meticulously restored as a design feature, the loading dock transformed into a community space that honored the building's industrial past. Our approach had emphasized sustainability alongside luxury, historical integrity alongside modern convenience. The review board had been impressed enough to award us the contract over Westview, a fact Tom would discover in approximately 12 hours. As dessert arrived, an elaborate cake adorned with sugar flowers and a discreet "Happy Anniversary" inscription that seemed almost apologetic in this business-focused setting, I felt my phone vibrate again. Another text from Megan. Just confirmed with Olivia. All financial transfers complete and documentation secured. You're fully protected. Olivia Rodriguez, my financial advisor, had been instrumental in helping me disentangle my assets from Tom's over the past 2 years. It had been a delicate process, ensuring everything was legal and documented while keeping Tom unaware of the extent of my financial independence. The inheritance from my grandmother, which Tom had always dismissed as pin money, had been my seed funding for Cascade. The earnings from our early projects had been carefully reinvested, growing into a substantial business that now rivaled Westview in certain market segments. Everything okay? Tom asked, noticing me checking my phone. Fine, I smiled, slipping it back into my clutch. Just a reminder about tomorrow's meeting. With the designer, he nodded absently. Don't let her talk you into anything too extravagant for the Watson property. We need to maximize profit margins on that one. If only he knew that I had already purchased the Watson property through one of Cascade's investment subsidiaries. Westview had been contracted merely to handle the initial renovation, work that my company would soon take over directly once certain contractual milestones had been reached. I'll keep it reasonable, I assured him, allowing him to assume, as he always did, that I understood and supported his vision without question. As the evening wound down, Tom grew increasingly animated in his conversation with Vanessa, their heads bent together over what he claimed were presentation materials, but what I suspected were plans extending beyond tomorrow's meeting. Kevin occasionally glanced in my direction, a flicker of discomfort crossing his features whenever he caught my eye. I wondered if Kevin knew about Tom and Vanessa. I wondered if he suspected what was coming tomorrow. As Tom's business partner, he would certainly feel the impact when the Sullivan Building contract announcement went public. Unlike Tom, Kevin had always treated me with genuine respect, occasionally asking my opinion on design elements for Westview projects and actually listening to my responses. I felt a momentary twinge of regret that he would be caught in the crossfire of tomorrow's revelations. It's getting late, I suggested as the restaurant began to empty around us. Shouldn't we head home? Big day tomorrow. Tom checked his watch, seeming surprised by the time. You're right. Kevin, we should get some rest before the Sullivan meeting. He turned to Vanessa with a smile that contained a hidden message. And you should finalize those presentation materials we discussed. The ride home was filled with Tom's monologue about tomorrow's meeting, his expectations, his confidence, his plans for celebrating when the contract was secured. I made appropriate noises of support and agreement, all while mentally reviewing my own schedule for the morning. 8 a.m. Final meeting with Daniel Martinez to review legal documentation. 10 a.m. Sullivan Building contract announcement goes public. 9:30 a.m. Meeting with Eleanor to coordinate responses to press inquiries. 10:02 a.m. The time of Tom's meeting. With the review board, a meeting where he would discover the contract had already been awarded. Somewhere in that timeline, Tom would likely receive the news. Somewhere in that timeline, he would realize his carefully constructed plans had collapsed. And somewhere in that timeline, he would return home to find the documentation of his affair alongside divorce papers, carefully prepared by Daniel's firm. When we arrived home, Tom immediately headed for his home office, claiming he needed to review some final details before tomorrow. I knew without checking that he was calling Vanessa. These late-night review sessions had become his transparent excuse over the past months. I climbed the stairs to our bedroom alone, as I had so many nights recently. Opening my closet, I pushed aside the carefully curated Becca wardrobe, the feminine dresses and casual ensembles Tom approved of, to reveal the section of tailored suits and professional attire I wore to Cascade's offices, but never around him. Tomorrow, I would no longer need to maintain this divided wardrobe, just as I would no longer need to maintain my divided life. In the ensuite bathroom, I removed my makeup and studied my reflection. The woman looking back at me was not the ornamental wife Tom had described in his toast. She was the founder and CEO of a successful restoration company, the architect whose vision had won the Sullivan building contract, the strategist who had outmaneuvered Westview Development at every turn. For years, I had allowed Tom to see only what he expected to see. Tomorrow, the full picture would be revealed, and nothing would ever be the same. I heard his footsteps on the stairs an hour later, his attempt at quiet movements betrayed by the creaking of the third step. He entered the bedroom to find me already in bed, pretending to be absorbed in a book, one of the architectural histories. I no longer bothered to hide, knowing he never looked closely enough to notice what I was actually reading. "All set for tomorrow?" I asked, glancing up. "Absolutely," he replied with the overconfidence that had once seemed charming but now registered as arrogance. "The Sullivan contract is practically guaranteed. The review board loves our vision." I smiled non-committally, returning to my book. "That's wonderful." "We should celebrate properly tomorrow night," he suggested, loosening his tie. "Just the two of us. Maybe that new restaurant on the riverfront?" The suggestion surprised me. It had been months since Tom had proposed a dinner with just the two of us. I wondered if this was guilt manifesting, a preemptive attempt to soften whatever blow he was planning to deliver. Perhaps tomorrow was when he intended to tell me about Vanessa. Perhaps the apartment lease had been finalized. Perhaps he thought a public setting would prevent a scene when he announced he was leaving. "That sounds nice," I said, knowing neither of us would be in the mood for celebration by tomorrow evening. "But let's see how the day goes. You might be too busy with the Sullivan project." "Never too busy to celebrate with my beautiful wife," he replied, the endearment sounding hollow after an evening of dismissive comments. I set my book aside and turned off my bedside lamp, settling under the covers as Tom disappeared into the bathroom. Through the partially open door, I could hear him on his phone again, voice lowered to a whisper. "Tomorrow after the announcement." "Yes, I know. She has no idea. Everything's arranged." I closed my eyes, allowing the fragments of his conversation to wash over me without emotional response. Whatever plans Tom and Vanessa had made for tomorrow would soon be irrelevant. The carefully constructed reality he believed in was about to shatter, revealing the truth he had been too blind to see. Sleep came surprisingly easily that night. There's a certain peace that comes with knowing exactly what lies ahead, even when, perhaps especially when, others remain oblivious to the coming storm. Morning dawned clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the windows as my alarm chimed softly at 6:30 a.m. Tom was still asleep beside me, his features relaxed in unconsciousness. For a moment, I allowed myself to remember the early days of our marriage, before the dismissals became routine, before his ambition curdled into arrogance, before Vanessa. There had been love there once, or at least I had believed there was. I slipped quietly from bed and into the shower, letting the hot water wash away any lingering sentimentality. By the time Tom's alarm sounded at 7:00, I was already dressed in my chosen power suit, hair styled in a sleek professional updo that would have surprised him had he been paying attention. "You're up early?" he commented groggily, reaching for his phone to check messages. No doubt there were several from Vanessa already. "Big day," I replied simply. "Meeting with Eleanor, remember?" Right, he nodded, his attention already on his screen. The Watson property staging. I didn't correct him. Let him believe what he wanted for a few hours more. "Good luck with the Sullivan presentation," I said, gathering my portfolio and briefcase. Items Tom had never noticed were far more professional than what a simple interior decorator would carry. "Luck?" He looked up with that familiar, confident smile. "We don't need luck. We need the review board to recognize the obvious best proposal when they see it." The irony was almost painful. "Of course," I agreed. "I'll see you this evening? For that celebration dinner?" "Absolutely," he confirmed, already heading for the shower. "I'll make reservations at Riverside. 8:00? "Perfect," I said, knowing neither of us would be keeping that appointment. The morning air was crisp as I drove toward downtown Portland, the familiar skyline coming into view as I crossed the bridge. In my rearview mirror, I could see our house, growing smaller, the beautifully renovated Craftsman that had been my first major project, though Tom believed he had orchestrated the renovation himself. In reality, I had designed every element, hired the contractors through Cascade's network, and implemented the historical restoration techniques that had preserved its original character while modernizing its functionality. Tom had taken credit for the results, of course. "I managed the whole project," he had told friends proudly. "Becca just picked the colors and fixtures." My first stop was Daniel Martinez's office, where my lawyer was waiting with final documentation. Daniel had been recommended by Megan 2 years ago when I first began separating my finances from Tom's. His specialty in complex divorces involving business assets had proven invaluable. "Everything is in order," he confirmed as we reviewed the paperwork one last time. "The timing of the Sullivan announcement works in our favor. It establishes Cascade Restoration as a legitimate competitor to Westview, not a retaliatory entity created during marital difficulties." "And the documentation of Tom's relationship with Vanessa?" I asked. Daniel nodded grimly. "All properly prepared with appropriate timestamps and verification. The apartment lease in her name, paid for from his secondary account. The hotel receipts. The text messages you were able to legally access from your shared cloud account. It's comprehensive without being excessive." "And legally obtained," I confirmed. The last thing I wanted was ethical complications. Everything had been done by the book, just as Cascade's growth had been built on legitimate business practices, not insider information from Tom's company. "Completely legal," Daniel assured me. "Your restraint in this matter has been admirable, Rebecca. Many clients in your position would have been tempted to take more aggressive actions." I smiled slightly at this. My approach had never been about revenge, despite how it might appear to Tom when everything was revealed. It had been about creating something genuine, a company that reflected my values and vision, while protecting myself from the inevitable fallout when Tom's dismissal of my capabilities collided with the reality of what I had built. "What time? Will the process server deliver the divorce papers to your home?" I asked. "They're scheduled for 11 a.m., Daniel confirmed. "Based on the timeline you provided, that should be after he learns about the Sullivan contract, but before he has time to fully process the implications." I nodded, satisfied with the sequence of events. "And my personal items?" "The moving service is confirmed for 11:30. They'll pack and transport everything on your list to the new loft. Your personal security will be present to ensure there are no issues." The loft was another project Cascade had renovated. A beautiful space in a converted warehouse not unlike the Sullivan building. I had designed it myself, creating a home that reflected my aesthetic and professional sensibilities without compromise. It had been waiting, fully furnished but unoccupied, for this exact moment. As I left Daniel's office, my phone alerted me to breaking news. Major development contract awarded. Historic Sullivan Building renovation goes to Cascade Restoration. The announcement had gone live, exactly as scheduled. By now, it would be appearing on industry news sites, local business publications, and the social media feeds of everyone in Portland's development community. Tom would see it any minute if he hadn't already. My phone rang almost immediately. Eleanor. "It's out," she said without preamble. "Local business channels are already calling for comments. How do you want to handle this?" "I'll be there." "In 15 minutes, I replied, heading toward my car. "Hold all responses until we can coordinate." "Rebecca." Eleanor's voice softened slightly. "Are you ready for this? Once you step into the public role as Cascade's founder, there's no going back to anonymity." I paused, considering her question. For 3 years, I had operated largely behind the scenes, allowing Eleanor to be Cascade's public face when necessary. Today would change that permanently. Today, Rebecca Wilson would be revealed as not just Tom's decorative wife, but as the architectural visionary behind Cascade Restoration. "I'm ready," I confirmed. "It's time to stop hiding." As I drove toward Cascade's offices, located in a beautifully restored former factory building in the Pearl District, my phone began ringing incessantly. Kevin, the investment group backing the Watson property. Several numbers I didn't recognize, likely journalists. And finally, inevitably, Tom. I let them all go to voicemail, focusing on navigating morning traffic. Whatever chaos was unfolding would still be there when I reached the office. For now, I needed these final moments of preparation before stepping fully into the life I had built for myself. Cascade's headquarters reflected everything I valued in design: original brick walls and exposed timber beams balanced with modern glass partitions and state-of-the-art technology. The open workspace buzzed with excitement as I entered, employees gathering around monitors displaying news of the Sullivan contract announcement. They turned as I walked in, breaking into spontaneous applause. Unlike at Westview, everyone at Cascade knew exactly who I was and what I had built. Here, I had never been just Tom's wife who makes spaces pretty. Here, I was the founder, the visionary, the architect whose designs had won increasingly prestigious contracts. "Congratulations, Rebecca," called Adam, our head of operations. "The Sullivan announcement is everywhere. And Westview's stock is already responding," added Olivia, who had left her financial firm to join Cascade full-time 6 months ago. Down 8% in pre-market trading on the news they lost the contract. I set my briefcase on my desk, drafting table positioned in the center of the open office rather than isolated in a corner office, and took a deep breath. "Thank you all," I said, addressing the gathered team. "Today marks a significant milestone for Cascade. The Sullivan Building represents exactly what we've been working toward: preservation that honors history while creating functional, sustainable spaces for the future." Eleanor approached, handing me a coffee in my favorite mug, one adorned with famous architectural blueprints. "Ready to face the press? They're clamoring for the story behind the mysterious new firm that beat out established Westview development." I smiled, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. Mysterious no longer. It's time for Cascade to step fully into the spotlight. My phone buzzed again. Tom for the 4th time. This time I answered. "Rebecca." His voice was tight with controlled fury. "Where are you?" "At work," I replied simply. "Work?" he sputtered. "You mean with that designer?" Because I just got some very interesting news about the Sullivan contract, and apparently it's been awarded to some company called Cascade Restoration, a company no one has ever heard of, run by someone named... He paused for dramatic effect. Rebecca Wilson. Yes, I confirmed calmly. That's correct. The silence that followed was profound, the sound of Tom's world rearranging itself to accommodate information that contradicted everything he had believed. This is a joke, he finally said. Some kind of mistake. You don't run a restoration company, you decorate houses. I'm an architect, Tom. I always have been. Cascade Restoration has been operating for 3 years. We specialize in sustainable historic renovation, like the Sullivan Building project. Another long silence then. 3 years? You've been running a company behind my back for 3 years? Not behind your back, I corrected. I've been quite open about my work. You simply never asked. You never noticed. You were too busy explaining to everyone how I should stick to making spaces pretty. This is insane, he hissed, his voice lowering as if he were in a public space. I imagined him standing in the lobby of the review board building, preparing for a meeting that was now pointless. You used insider information from Westview. You stole our ideas. No, Tom, I interrupted firmly. Cascade's proposal was entirely original, based on architectural principles you've consistently dismissed. The review board awarded us the contract on merit. We'll see about that, he snapped. Kevin and I are meeting with our attorneys right after the review board. This isn't over, Rebecca. Actually, it is, I said quietly. When you get home, you'll find divorce papers waiting, along with documentation of your relationship with Vanessa. Another stunned silence. What are you talking about? The apartment you leased for her, the hotel meetings, the late-night calls. I know everything, Tom. You're spying on me? His voice rose with indignation. No, I'm paying attention, something you might have tried sometime in the past 10 years. I could practically hear him struggling to regain control of the situation, to find an angle, a leverage point, something that would put him back in his familiar position of authority. The house, he finally said. The investment properties. Our accounts. All properly documented and legally separated, I informed him. My inheritance funded Cascade's launch. The company's success has funded my independence. A moving service will collect my personal belongings today. You can't do this, he said, but there was a note of uncertainty beneath the anger now. I already have, I replied. Oh, and Tom, the Watson property you mentioned last night? Cascade acquired it through a subsidiary last year. Westview has just been managing the initial renovation phase under contract to us. This final revelation seemed to break something in him. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its confident edge entirely. All this time, he said quietly, all this time you were building this separate life, while I thought you were just decorating, I finished for him. Just making spaces pretty. Just being supportive. I know exactly what you thought, Tom. You told me. Repeatedly. In front of your colleagues, your friends, your business partners. The line went silent again, but I could hear his breathing, rapid and shallow. I have to go, I said finally. I have a press conference about the Sullivan Building in 30 minutes. And Tom? Don't bother with those dinner reservations for tonight. I ended the call, setting my phone down carefully on my desk. Around me, Cascade's office had gone quiet, everyone pretending to be absorbed in work while obviously aware that something momentous had just occurred. Eleanor approached, resting a supportive hand on my shoulder. Well, she said simply, that's done. I nodded, feeling a curious mixture of emotions, relief, sadness for what might have been, and most prominently, a sense of liberation so profound it was almost dizzying. The press is waiting, Eleanor reminded me gently. I stood, straightening, my jacket and gathering the portfolio containing Cascade's designs for the Sullivan Building, the very designs that had won us the contract, the very vision Tom had dismissed as impractical and unmarketable. "Let's not keep them waiting," I said, moving toward the conference room where Portland's business press had gathered. It was time to step fully into the light, to claim publicly what I had built quietly, to be recognized not as Tom's decorative wife but as the architect and entrepreneur I had always been. Behind me, the phone on my desk began ringing again. Tom, no doubt, with more protests or accusations, or perhaps, though I doubted it, apologies. But I didn't turn back. That chapter was closed. Today, a new one began. As I walked into the conference room, cameras flashing and reporters calling out questions, I felt a smile spread across my face. Not the practiced, pleasant smile I had worn for years at Tom's side, but a genuine expression of pride and accomplishment. Whatever came next, I would face it as my complete self, no longer diminished by someone else's limited perception. "Good morning," I greeted the assembled press. "I'm Rebecca Wilson, founder and CEO of Cascade Restoration. Thank you for joining us as we discuss our vision for the Sullivan Building. 6 months can change everything." The Sullivan Building now stands as a testament to what preservation should be: original timber beams restored to their honey gold luster, brick walls carefully cleaned rather than covered, industrial windows that flood the spaces with natural light. Where Tom would have gutted history in favor of sterile modernity, Cascade Restoration created a harmonious dialogue between past and present, honoring the building's heritage while seamlessly integrating contemporary needs. I stand at the windows of my top-floor office, watching Portland's autumn rain trace patterns down the restored glass. The raindrops catch the late afternoon light, creating prisms that dance across the reclaimed wood floors. This space, once the warehouse foreman's office, now serves as my design studio, the heart of Cascade's operations. My phone chimes with a familiar alert: maintenance request from the Watson property. I allow myself a small smile before opening the message. Unit 4B reporting persistent draft from west-facing windows. Tenant requesting inspection and repair. Assigned to Wilson Thomas. 6 months ago, when Tom stood in my office, the same office where he'd once told me I wouldn't understand real development work, his face had carried an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, though certainly that had blazed during our initial confrontation. Not even humiliation, though that had flared too when the business community discovered that his decorative wife had outmaneuvered him professionally. No, what I saw that day was something rarer. Recognition. "I don't have anywhere else to go," he'd said simply, standing before my desk in a suit that suddenly seemed to hang loosely on his frame. "Westview is finished. My reputation is—" He gestured vaguely, unable to complete the sentence. The aftermath of the Sullivan Building announcement had been swift and comprehensive. Westview Development's stock had plummeted as investors lost confidence. The Watson property revelation had triggered an investigation into potential conflicts of interest. And the divorce, with its documented evidence of Tom's relationship with Vanessa, had become fodder for industry gossip. Kevin had managed to separate himself from the fallout, taking what remained of Westview's viable projects to form a new company. But Tom had been left with nothing. No company, no partner, no wife. Even Vanessa had disappeared from his life, once the apartments he'd leased for her were no longer within his financial reach. "What do you want from me, Tom?" I'd asked that day, genuinely curious. We hadn't spoken since the day everything had changed, since he'd discovered that the simple homemaker he'd dismissed for years had built a thriving company right under his nose. "A job," he'd answered, the words clearly painful to pronounce. "Any job. I've tried everywhere else. Nobody will touch me." I'd studied him then, trying to reconcile this humbled man with the arrogant husband who had once patted my hand and told me to stick to making spaces pretty. Part of me, the part still nursing wounds from years of dismissal, had wanted to savor his downfall, to send him away with the same casual disregard he'd shown for my ambitions. But I'd built Cascade Restoration on principles of preservation, not destruction, on recognizing value where others saw only obsolescence, on seeing potential beneath damaged facades. The only opening we have is in property maintenance, I'd told him, watching his face carefully. Handling tenant requests, coordinating repairs, ensuring our restored buildings receive the care they need to maintain their integrity. I'd expected refusal. Tom Wilson, former CEO of Westview Development, reduced to changing light bulbs and fixing leaky faucets? It seemed inconceivable, but he'd surprised me. "I'll take it," he'd said immediately, eyes focused on some middle distance. "I need to work. I need something." That had been 5 months ago. 5 months of Tom learning the intimate details of building maintenance, of understanding why those outdated features he'd been so eager to demolish were worth preserving, of seeing firsthand how Cascade's philosophy translated into spaces that tenants cherished rather than merely tolerated. I pick up my phone and type a quick response to the maintenance request. "Approved. Schedule inspection for tomorrow morning." Then I add, almost as an afterthought, "Note: original windows may need resealing. Reference Sullivan restoration protocols rather than replacement." Tom would understand that instruction now. He'd spent 3 weeks working alongside our restoration team during the final phases of the Sullivan building renovation, learning our techniques for preserving historical elements while improving functionality. He'd been a quick study, perhaps quicker than I'd expected. A knock at my office door pulls me from my thoughts. Eleanor enters, carrying a portfolio of designs for our newest project, the revitalization of Portland's old library building, another contract we'd won over larger, more established firms. "The board loved the concept," she announces, setting the portfolio on my desk. "Especially the reading room restoration. They said it was the perfect balance of historical accuracy and modern function." That was Tom's suggestion, actually, I admit, still finding it strange to credit him with design insights. He remembered there used to be skylights that had been covered during a 1970s renovation. We're uncovering and restoring them. Eleanor raises an eyebrow, settling into the chair across from my desk. "He's come a long way from gut the interior, keep the facade," she observes. I nod, returning to my seat. It's been educational for him. "And for you?" she asks with the directness that has characterized our relationship from the beginning. I consider her question. These 6 months have transformed more than just Tom's understanding of preservation. They've changed something fundamental in me as well, a shift from the quiet resentment of being underestimated to the confident assurance of being recognized for exactly who I am and what I can accomplish. I don't need his validation anymore. I realize aloud. I don't think I ever really did. Eleanor smiles, the expression softening the distinguished lines of her face. That's the real victory, isn't it? Not the contracts or the acclaim, but the freedom from needing approval from those who couldn't see your value. Speaking of acclaim, I say, changing the subject slightly, the Architectural Heritage Foundation called this morning, the Sullivan building has been nominated for their annual Preservation Award. Well deserved, Eleanor nods. Will you attend the ceremony yourself this time, or send a representative? The question carries weight beyond its surface simplicity. For years, I had allowed others, mainly Eleanor, to be the public face of my accomplishments, remaining in the shadows as Tom's wife, rather than stepping forward as Rebecca Wilson, architect and preservationist. Even after the Sullivan building revelation, I had maintained a certain reserve in public settings, letting our projects speak for themselves rather than claiming the spotlight. I'll attend, I decide. It's time Cascade's founder was fully visible. Good, Eleanor approves. And will you bring anyone? The invitation includes a +1. The question hangs in the air, loaded with implications. In the months since the divorce, there have been interested parties, a developer from Seattle, an architectural professor from Reed College. Even Kevin had expressed interest once the dust settled. But I had kept my personal life deliberately simple, focusing on Cascade's growth and my own rediscovery of who Rebecca Wilson was outside the constraints of being Tom's wife. No +1, I answer. Just me is enough. Eleanor nods, understanding as always. She gathers her notes and rises to leave, pausing at the door. Oh, I nearly forgot. Tom completed the assessment of the Morgan Street property. His report was surprisingly thorough. He's included detailed documentation of all the original features worth preserving and suggestions for restoration approaches. This information stops me short. The Morgan Street assessment had been a test of sorts, an older building, badly neglected that most developers would immediately condemn as beyond saving. I had assigned Tom the evaluation, expecting a cursory report. The fact that he had seen beyond the surface damage to the architectural bones beneath showed a shift in perspective I hadn't anticipated. Leave the report on my desk, I request. I'll review it tonight. After Eleanor leaves, I turn back to the windows, watching as the rain intensifies, blurring the city skyline. Portland in autumn has always been my favorite. The quality of light, the way the rain revitalizes rather than depresses, the sense of possibility that comes with seasonal transition. My phone buzzes with another notification. A text from Tom. Completed Morgan Street assessment. Building has significant issues but extraordinary potential. Original millwork intact beneath multiple layers of paint. Support beams sound. Worth the investment if approached correctly. I read the message twice, struck by the language, extraordinary potential, worth the investment, phrases that echo Cascade's philosophy rather than Westview's profit-focused demolition approach. Has Tom truly changed his perspective, or is he simply telling me what he thinks I want to hear? The real test would come tomorrow at our quarterly planning meeting, where the Morgan Street property would be discussed as a potential next project. Tom had been invited to present his findings, his first opportunity to contribute to Cascade's strategy, rather than simply implementing decisions made by others. A sudden impulse has me reaching for my phone. Dinner at 7? There's a new Thai place on Morrison that's getting excellent reviews. I hit send before I can reconsider, not entirely sure why I'm extending the invitation. His response comes quickly. I'd like that. Should I bring the Morgan Street documentation? No, I reply. Just yourself. This isn't about work. Setting. My phone down, I recognize that this dinner invitation isn't about reconciliation. Tom and I are irrevocably changed, both individually and in relation to each other. There will be no returning to our former marriage, no pretending that the events of the past 6 months haven't fundamentally altered who we are. But perhaps there is the possibility of something new. Not a relationship based on his dismissal and my acquiescence, but a connection between equals who see each other clearly. Perhaps, like the buildings we restore, what was valuable in our connection can be preserved while the damaged elements are removed. I gather my coat and portfolio, preparing to leave for the day. As I lock my office, I pause to look back at the space I've created. The drafting table positioned to catch the best natural light, the walls lined with architectural plans, the awards Cascade has accumulated in its brief but impressive existence. This is who I always was, even when Tom couldn't or wouldn't see it. 6 months ago, I stood in this same spot, newly divorced, my dual identity finally unified, uncertain what the future would hold beyond the professional success I had secured. Now, with Cascade thriving and my own identity firmly established, independent of Tom's perception, I find myself contemplating possibilities I hadn't expected. Not a return to what was, but perhaps the beginning of something that never had the chance to exist before. A relationship between Rebecca Wilson, architect and preservationist, and Tom Wilson, a man learning to see value in what he once would have discarded without a second thought. As I walk toward the elevator, my phone chimes with a final message from Tom. Looking forward to tonight. And Rebecca, thank you. Not just for dinner, but for the second chance I didn't deserve. I step into the elevator, a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. The future, like a historic building awaiting restoration, holds more possibility than most people recognize at first glance. The trick is knowing what to preserve, what to remove, and what to carefully rebuild, creating something that honors its history while establishing a new identity all its own. The doors close, and I descend toward an evening that feels unexpectedly like the first page of a new chapter rather than the closing of an old one. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.